My name is Jeffrey Sachs, about whom you may have heard something to my embarrassment this morning. I'm very delighted to return here to YU, which was so absolutely foundational in my own education. I was so tickled pink earlier in the lounge downstairs, and I'm so pleased that Dr. Berger is here because 25 years ago, I was involved in the student struggle to save Revel, the triple SR. And the struggle was actually run out of my apartment on 187th Street. So to have gone from studying history at the feet of Dr. Berger to seeing myself as an artifact of history on the wall was quite thrilling. But it really is wonderful to come back here and to be involved with something that has, over the last number of years, become a great interest. My wife might say something of an obsession. And to talk with Mori v'Rabi v'Yedidi, Professor Avram Holtz, who I would think that at a conference on Agnon, this really is the case where you can say he literally needs no introduction. But for the sake of people that may be watching this in distant history, I'll just remind us all that Avram is Professor Emeritus of Hebrew Literature at JTS here in New York. He is the author and researcher and annotator and editor of a large variety of important scholarship in Hebrew literature in general and in Agnon in specific, and most notably, not just for our conversation, the fully annotated edition of Agnon's Hachnasat Kala, and we hope soon, Bimheira V'Yameinu Amen, the companion volume on Tmol Shel Shom on Agnon's Only Yesterday, which is, what's the update? In the works, as it has been for 25 years? Okay, for quite a while. And he was not too long ago made a member of the Academia Lashon Ivrit, the Hebrew Language Academy in Jerusalem, which, for those that may not understand the significance, is a great honor indeed.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
He's the father of Shalom Holtz.
And in this context, his greatest ichus is to say he is the father of Professor Shalom Holtz. Yes. And we wanted to talk a little bit today about your work, about your most important scholarship in regards to Agnon, the work on Hachnasat Kala, and hopefully soon Tmol Shel Shom. And in the context of our day-long conversation about Agnon's Sipurei Eretz Yisrael, it is of course impossible to overlook the importance of Tmol Shel Shom as the Sipur Eretz Yisraeli of a sort. But let me step back a few feet to ask about this project you've been involved in, how you came to it, how the work on Hachnasat Kala and what you learned in doing this really unparalleled work in Hebrew literature, although of course there are counterexamples in other cultures, how the work on Hachnasat Kala then went on to inform what you've been doing for these past 2+ decades in working on Tmol Shel Shom. So why don't you give us some of the background to it?
Some of the background. Well, all sessions on Agnon that I teach or present, I start by saying, never forget that Agnon was a Galician. Now, apparently,
there aren't too many other audiences where that line would get an applause.
Pardon? They always laugh. My wife reminds me. So, yes.
Galiciana means Golei Tzion, the real Jews.
The real Jews. Oh wow. Yes. Okay. That's in the books too. Yes. And I am a Galiciana on both sides, my mother and my father. And I grew up with one Galiciana grandfather, and we spoke Galiciana Yiddish. But when I went to Hebrew school, they decided that that's not the way to pronounce words. And my grandfather, Shalom Nedel, Zichrono Livracha, taught me how to read Hebrew. So I read Moediani Lefanechu, Ulayni L'Shabayach. And I thought that was the only way to read. When I came to Hebrew school, they said, Oleinu L'Shabayach. A few years later, so my grandfather made his adjustments. A few years later, I went to Herzliya Hebrew High School, where they did not teach Agnon. I went to Herzliya Teacher Seminary, where they did not teach Agnon. I guess he wasn't part of the corpus or part of the Zionist idea. I don't know exactly. I never had the chutzpah to ask later, subsequently, why they didn't teach it. And at one point, in 1962, no, let me not say, in 1959, excuse me, 1952, I went to Eretz Yisrael. And when I came back from before I left for Eretz Yisrael, my Hebrew grammar teacher, whose name some of you may know, Daniel Persky, approached me and said, Avraham hizaher shelo yikalkalu es ha'ivris shelcho. So I was warned, and I came back from Eretz Yisrael speaking and reading in the Bahabara Sfaradit. Baruch Hashem. Okay. At which point, the first Friday night, my grandfather said, Jetzt verstehe ich Gunish. Somehow I do suggest, I don't know if you have it here or not, but there was a program on October 21st in Galei Tzahal.
Yeah.
You have it?
You can find it online.
You could find it online, and I'm suggesting that you listen to it because you will hear Agnon have the same problems. And all of Hachnasat Kala, including the title, all of the Hebrew in Hachnasat Kala, in my opinion, Hachnosas Kala. And I even had the audacity to write that. And it's interesting that a few months, maybe even a year or two before, we were at a Levaya. And Professor Dov Sedan, also a Galiciano, from the city of Brod, came over to me and he said in Hebrew, Ani mashbi'acha, שתציין בספר שהשם של בעל הגולה, לבעל הגולה, שמו נוסטן נוטה, ולא נתן נטע, ולא נתן נטע, ולא נוסטן נוטה. אמרתי לו, פרופסור סדן, אנחנו בלוויה. אני משביעך כאן ובמקום הזה. So you will see in this book, N-O-O-T-E. That's Nute. And that's the pronunciation, I think, with which Agnon wrote.
There's an amusing passage at the beginning of Book 1 of Tmol Shel Shom, where Yitzchak goes out on his first day looking for work as a laborer.
Sure.
And
I
Agnon,
wrote about that too.
You wrote about everything. That's what we're here to talk about. And how does he render it? I'm looking for the passage right now.
Yes.
But in order to render it, he renders all the tufs with a samach.
Correct.
So that the Hebrew,
so
the modern
Pesach
Hebrew
Tikva is Pesach Tikva, and the Ilonois, and it's
Right,
Galiciana. He and that person who made fun of him in the Tmol Shel Shom, in this book at the beginning, because he made fun of the fact that he wasn't speaking Sfaradit Hebrew. He was speaking the Hebrew that he knew from Galicia. And of course, Agnon wanted to replicate that pronunciation in order so that we follow Yitzchak Hummer as his language becomes acclimated or acculturated or whatever it is that he has to do. And in truth, I don't think he speaks Hebrew at any point in the book. Because between he did, or they did, Agnon almost says that in this book, in Shmol Shulshon, that in private, when Ben Yehuda was not around, they spoke among themselves Yiddish. And there's always a woman there, and we'll come back to this at the end. There's a woman there who reminds Yitzchak Kummer that he's forgetting his Buchach Yiddish. And he's beginning to pronounce words in some other way. And heavens help us, he's introducing all kinds of Arabic words and all kinds of words that we never heard about in Buchach. What's he doing? But at any rate, back to the beginning. Now, Agnon had his own way of getting even with that young man who made fun of him. By the way, there's also a Rebbe on the train who didn't exactly support the Zionist venture and the Zionist agenda. And he said all kinds of nasty things in the category of, you could say, klalot. And of course, he pronounced it also in Galician Yiddish, but it was a little different than Buchach Yiddish. He lengthened, see, nicht zaten, but zaten. And Agnon wants you to read it that way. So I came up with the idea this time around that I think it's important that we put out a tape so that, pardon?
To accompany the book.
So to accompany the book. Today, technically or technologically, it's not such a difficult thing to do, and hopefully we will get around to it.
So let me go back. In
Yes.
other words, the origins of the work on Achnasat Kala.
The origins of the work Achnasat Kala begin here. The origins of the book begin here. This book was published by JTS, and again, I think it's, if not the first, then it's among the first. Why does it take so long to get through? You see, this book is 607 pages, and there are 31 lines to a page. And I say that, and I repeat, that every page requires another kind of expertise. Different kinds throughout the book. You're just moving along with all kinds of things. So the contemporary reader, this book had this book as a model.
This is the annotated
This
Ulysses.
is the annotated Ulysses, which has now come out in the second edition because there are two editions of the Ulysses text. Well, many years ago, what was it, 19? When she called me, well, whatever it was. Yeah, Rachel Edelman, who is Shokin's daughter, Shokin's granddaughter, and so she has her own yichus. She called me on the telephone. She said, I heard about the work that you're doing. Please bring all the work. I want to see what you're doing. I want to understand what you're doing. So I said, what I want to do is I want to guide the reader through the book, because there are literary allusions, and we'll talk more about that later. And there are linguistic problems, all kinds of questions that arise, in addition to which we need maps, because the landscape. This book is entirely based, actually the maps in the front were drawn by my wife, and here's a map of Galicia, eastern Galicia, and the actual route that this Yidel Chassid took, he had a balagola, and he walked around or traveled around eastern Galicia. And I began to read the book. The more I read, the less I understood. And I was beginning to hear things, and I was beginning to study things. And from the very beginning, I realized that whatever apparatus, so I took the Ulysses model, the James Joyce Ulysses, and I brought, and I mentioned to her that this is the model. The first comment was,
What?
Jews.
Why was it obvious that this should be the model for you?
Because I didn't.
There are a whole variety. You've drawn our attention in the past to scholarly work, meta scholarship on the work of annotation.
Yes.
And it's not obvious that this model
Right.
should be preferred over a
Okay,
different
so-
model. Why
correct.
did you prefer
For
this?
this
And
model.
maybe say a word about what this model
This
represents.
model is, you have the Ulysses text, which is standard. So we have one edition. There was let's use Hachnasat Kala for a moment. This is based on a book which Agnon rewrote 4 times.
I'm gonna pass this copy around so people should see it. It belongs to the Mendel Gottesman Library, so let's make sure we get it back. Otherwise, someone won't get the
and it's on
diploma
my
at
card.
the end of
Curiously, the first edition of this was printed in America, was published in America, Hamikla. Then Agnon came back, and that's very typical of Agnon. He comes back to the same work, and he came back again and again.
each time expanding
Each
it by
time
many
expanding
thousands
it,
of words.
correct. And the English translation that was published in the United States and then reprinted now in the Toby series is not, unfortunately, thank you, said it, not I, unfortunately not the last edition, which is the fullest edition of Hachnosas Kala. Hachnosas Kala, which is a book about the same size as this, after the Shoah, Agnon went back to writing a fuller edition. There was no more Buchach. There was no more Galicia. His world had been demolished. But he went back to his stories, and he expanded this book.
So come back again.
One moment, I'll
yeah.
get back to it. What I did in this book, the core story, which involves the Abderov telling an impoverished man who has to marry off his daughters. And for doing that, you must have dowry. You must have Nedinya. You must have Nedunya. You must have dowry. Now, where do you get dowry? You go around and you, yeah, okay, that's a nice word.
Yeah.
You beg. But if you're going to beg like a Koptzin, they're going to give you Koptzonische Nedovis. You'll get a kopik here, another kopik there. But if you appear as a Gavir, and well, how does a Gavir look? You have to have a belly, you have to have a kapota, you have to have a, right?
And a driver.
And a driver, etc., etc. And that's what they do. They dress him up. They dress Rabudel up, and he's going on the road. Now that whole story, that aspect of the story, but first you go to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe has to confirm. And the Rebbe was no other than the Abderov, the Ohev Yisrael, the original Abraham Yehoshua Heschel. You go to, and that story is the core story in Hachnasat Kala, Hachnosas Kala. And then Agnon expanded it once, and expanded it twice, and expanded it a third time. So that's the origin of the story. So this book, unlike this one, what this book is watching Agnon go through the process of rewriting. So he takes the core story straight out of Nisim V'Niflos of the Abderov, The book is entitled Nisim V'Niflaot of the Apter Rab. There's one story in there, and that's the core story in Hachnosas Kal. He expands it. And what he does in the process is also create a Hebrew language so that you, the reader of the Hebrew language in the 20th century, will know that it's not really Hebrew, because these people didn't speak Hebrew. Maybe they davened in Hebrew, but they certainly didn't speak Hebrew. And he created his own Hebrew. So part of my job for this book was to recreate the Yiddish that Agnon, because in the Nisim V'Niflos, they really don't converse much. The protagonists don't converse much, and there's not very much dialogue, but in this book there is. So I very much wanted the reader to understand that. So let's get back
And
to...
was the original plan that that's what you would be doing in the critical edition?
That's what...
And then all of the other
Right.
annotations
would come along. So when Rachel Edelman, Dr. Rachel Edelman, now she's the owner of the Shokin Publishing Company, when she saw what I had and
Which
what my model...
owns the copyright on the work.
Yeah, of course she has the copyright on Agnon, not only on the book. Because Agnon was, as she says in that program, Agnon was very fortunate that he didn't have to work as a teacher, he didn't have to work as a secretary, he didn't have to work at any job. He had to write. And Mr. Shokin was a taskmaster. I won't go into that detail. We can skip over it. Now, when she saw this was the Ulysses book, she said, Jews don't read that way. Jews read everything on the same page. And she took down the Mikraot Gedolot from the shelf that Shokin had published, as curiously as it is, in 1937. Hitler was already in power.
In Germany.
In Germany. Tarzaz, Berlin. And she said, that's the way the book is going to look.
So it was her.
So it's her
The irony, of course, is that one of the critiques on the book was that...
Oh, of course. One of the critiques of the book was,
let's hold
how
up
dare you take the Gemara page and apply it to Agnon and his mises. Kol minei bedayot, kol minei maasiyot. Who needs that? It's almost like chilul daf shabayit. It was as if you're taking the sacred page form and everything was explained in that article by the fact that I came from JTS. Only somebody from JTS could do such a thing, could do have such an aver. And curiously enough, just last week, somebody called me up. He's writing a book about all these kind of things among the Haredi community. So he said, do I have permission to quote? I said, please. So I sent him the article, and I would not have gotten to that review of the book except through Professor Tashma, who called me up on Friday, and he said, Avraham, lech uknei et yated ne'eman. I said, Ma li yated ne'eman? What? Li yated ne'eman? That's not my newspaper. He said, Tzei uknei. So Tashma Alav Shalom said, Tzei uknei, yotzi v'koni. So I bought it. Then I read what I read. But anyway, so that this format was really the format that was...
So let me turn our attention to the next topic,
Yeah.
which you already foreshadowed. In a essay a couple of years back by the literary critic Adam Kirsch on T'mol Shel Shom. It's kind of his thoughts on reading the Barbara Harshav translation of T'mol Shel Shom. I'll just add an asterisk into our conversation here that's a topic you've written on, but we're not going to go into that now. He points out and this is something that's relevant for your work, but it's maybe even more so for our work at the Toby Press in now trying to render an English translation of the works with a critical annotation, although we opted, perhaps motivated by market forces, for a different style of putting annotations in the back and leaving a clean text on the page. But Kirsch writes, the Mishnaic and biblical diction of Agnon's writing is a key to T'mol Shel Shom, to Only Yesterday. The translator works hard to render the echoes of biblical and rabbinic Hebrew in the modern Hebrew of Agnon's novel. But this can't really be done in English, which is one reason why the novel's texture ends up feeling thin, the translation that is. The plot, which was not published by the Toby Press, the plot and characterization are forced to bear much of the weight that in Hebrew must be borne by the language itself. Still, enough of these antique resonances come across to show how the language of Only Yesterday embodies its theme, which is the vertigo that results when a 20th century Jew returns to the land of his ancestors that his ancestors left 2,000 years earlier. So now here he's referring to having read the novel and experiencing the novel in translation. But if I'm understanding you correctly, that's part of what you're trying to do for the contemporary Hebrew reader
Correct.
As well.
Correct.
So could you say a word about that,
Yeah.
of what the
There are
contemporary
many-
Hebrew reader encounters in Agnon, and how this edition, and hopefully soon the edition of T'mol Shel Shom, is bridging that gap for the contemporary Hebrew audience?
It became clear to me, when working on this book, that we needed, the contemporary reader, I needed maps, I needed pictures, I needed music, because Agnon's works are full of music. And there are all kinds of sounds. So I have a file called Kolot T'mol Shel Shom. I could have had that here. So just one example, or many examples from here.
Do you want to turn our attention to you? We have it here on the text.
Oh, yeah, okay, so go ahead.
Right. So here, well, you have it here on the
Use it,
text.
you do it.
In other words, in a central passage at the beginning of the third book of T'mol Shel Shom, remember Yitzchak arrives. There are 4 sections to the work. The first book he spends in Yafo, then in
Just
Yerushalayim.
one moment, there is what he calls Reshit
Reshit,
Advarim.
right? A prologue
That's
of
the
sorts is the
prologue.
passage to Eretz Yisrael. So it's a passage between Yafo and Yerushalayim, back to Yafo, back to Yerushalayim. So in this section,
Just one second, 1908 through 1911. Those are the dates of T'mol Shel Shom. So
Which-
it's not, Tel Aviv is just beginning to be built. So you have to leave Tel Aviv out. You include Yafo, only certain streets in Yafo. Yerushalayim is not the contemporary Yerushalayim. It's only certain streets of Yerushalayim. We will need maps. We will need
Photographs.
pictures. We will need photographs. We will need many of which I have, or most of which I have, not all. But I still hope to be able to somehow get all the pictures I really want. And we'll talk more about pictures later.
I'll read the passage. Maybe I'll just
Yeah.
read it. Maybe I'll just read it in English,
Yes.
and
Yeah, go ahead.
and you'll comment as we go along. You'll annotate
Yeah.
my narration. One of the passengers said to the carter, to the Bal Agola, "Perhaps, Reb Zundel, you can sing something by
One
Betzalel
mistake.
Chazan."
Zindel.
Zindel.
Okay, no, I won't do this again.
No, you can.
But I want you to have, in order to appreciate the language or the tension in Agnon between modern Hebrew and the Hebrew that he wanted to evoke in this for sure, because this is early 19th century. this would require sort of a kind of a lecture of its own. But so this is early 19th century. Tmol Shalshom is early 20th century, and that's a different. It's a different country than the country or the state of Israel today. It's a different place.
So one of the
Agnon was part of that. He came in 1908. I almost think I know the ship on which he came. And I am looking for a picture of that ship, because if it wasn't that ship, it was a similar ship. How did he get there? How do you get out of Galicia through Trieste and the Mediterranean Sea?
You can see why the project has been going on for 25 years. That's the note on having read 5 words. So one of the passages is, perhaps you can sing something by Betzalel Chazan. Like...
Now, was Betzalel... I'm gonna.
No, this is what we wanted to do.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt him because I wanted to know. One thing you have to know many times over. Was this person a historical figure? Yes. But did he live? Is this his name or her name? Do we have pictures? Because we have a picture, I think the picture ought to appear. We'll talk more about pictures later. But right now, so we have this strange Balagola there. I should say Balagula, but okay. He's coming around to Sfaradi. See, he's in Yerushalayim already. And in Yerushalayim, who were the primary settlers of Yerushalayim? The original ones were Sfaradim, and there's very little about the Sfaradim. That's a Parsha Bifnei Atzma and Agnon and the Sfaradim, and Litvaks. Litvaks, and if you were a Galiciana, you were an outsider. And nothing helped you unless you changed your Hebrew. And your Yiddish, but yes, your pronunciation had to be Litvish. So he always felt, Agnon always felt, sort of unwanted. You weren't part of the group. Although there were people in Yerushalayim who made him, and in Yafo, who made him feel part of the group.
Okay, we have to move on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps you can sing something by Betzalel Chazan, like "Then all shall come to serve you." Ve'yasayu kol avdecho. How'd I do?
You did well. Okay. Via Sui. Okay, it's okay. We'll leave it.
The carter laughed and said, "I knew you would call me Zindel, but Zindel isn't my name. My name is Avremel." The man said to him, "Didn't I hear them call you Zindel?" Said he, "They call me Zindel because my younger brother was named Abraham after me."
Okay, we're going to stop here because for our purposes, I think we can stop here without going, because he once again repeats the request to hear V'yesoy.
So let me just skip to the end.
Skip to the end.
And now you want me to sing Betzalel Chazan's V'yesayu? That, my friend, is impossible. For once I was traveling on the road and I started singing V'yesayu kol avdecha, and the horses started quaking and shaking and jumping and leaping until their yoke came undone to serve the Holy One himself. You think I'm telling you made up things? The God's honest truth, I'm telling you, just as my name is Avremel and not Zindel.
Right.
You
And
can
now
hear
you
the
have it
horses
on
galloping.
tape.
Yeah, well, why didn't you want to say something about what you found?
We don't know if this is Betzalel Chazan, but this is...
Now my next chore is to really find out if this melody, which is sung in Eretz Yisrael in many kehilot, if that melody was around in the early 20th century and was the one that Betzalel Chazan, whose last name was Schulzinger, as it turns out, Betzalel Schulzinger, we even have a picture of him, introduced. It may or may not be. But if it isn't, it works, and if it is, it certainly works. But listen to the melody. Louder.
It's an audio, but there's a picture of Vishnitz Hasidim. Right? But they didn't want us to see them, so they show off the video. There it is.
And you can imagine all the horses running away.
So is Bitzalel Chazan a Galician?
Bitzalel Chazan had his own history. We'll leave it at that. Chances are he wasn't.
So now your point in identifying this tune potentially as the nigun of Betzalel Chazan for Ve'asayu as they're galloping, the horses are galloping away.
Correct. And therefore, I can't sing it for you because I'm not going to have the horses running away from us now. So the Balagola doesn't want to do it. Now, where did I get this from? There is a very important, extremely important, highly recommended for everybody who goes to visit the National Library. Please go to the Phonoteca, which is on the same floor directly opposite the Judaica Library. Go to the Music Library. Every piece of Jewish music is in that library. It's a phenomenal source for anybody.
Before we turn our attention back to another piece of what certain academics call the realia, a major agenda, a major aspect of the annotation is to uncover or to reveal or to simply cite the very many sources in Tanakh, in Chazal, in you name it, that Agnon is directly referencing, is indirectly referencing, is working in echoes to, is subverting in the text.
Correct.
And just the simple act of footnoting every Gemara and every Midrash and every line from the Machzor Yom Kippurim is a major effort, and part of the work. And
Correct.
presumably that's changed slightly. We know that you're a little, how shall we say, Luddite, technophobic, but you know that's been enhanced and aided with the advent of all of the many digital resources.
The very fact that we can think about publishing the new.
But here we get to an interesting question about the work of annotation as interpretation.
Correct.
Because these are not mere footnote references. Tehillim, Perek, Kaf Daled, Posuk, Zion. The very act of annotating is also an act of interpreting, because Agnon is doing different things when he's citing a variety of sources. Correct. Sometimes he's merely borrowing, and we've all encountered this in different aspects of Agnon scholarship. Someone will identify a particular source that Agnon is clearly echoing or riffing off of,
We had that
and
this
then
morning.
and then
We had
well,
that this morning.
it was done with great effect and properly done so. But we've all encountered other people that will identify a reference to something and will try to build a whole pile of interpretation based upon this. But to you, the reader, or to you, the scholar, you may think they're making a mountain out of a molehill. Sometimes Agnon is just quoted. Sometimes a reference is just a reference. Sometimes, as Sigmund told us, sometimes he's just borrowing a turn of phrase for its cadence, for its rhythm, and he's not trying to do the kind of intertextual bridge building. But a lot of times he is, and when he's doing that, sometimes he's doing it because he's drawing your attention to Perek in Tanakh, so that you'll think how the Yerushalayim of Tehillah is in context relative to the Yerushalayim in Yirmiyahu. In other cases, he'll build in a reference to Tehillah is built on a certain kind of framework of in interaction with a particular Rashi in Masechet Ta'anit about the Agadav, the Hulda, and the Bor. And if you identify that, then you can begin to unlock something underneath it. But a lot of times, he's quoting a source subversively, ironically.
Yes.
And it's not always clear to the reader, and readers of good conscience can debate what he's doing in any one thing. How do you see the act of annotating the source work, not the realia,
Correct.
not knowing how much this kopek was worth and the distance between this shtetl and that village, but the source work annotation? How do you view that as an act of interpretation and parshanut for the reader?
Well, you have it here, the Yoma.
Pardon?
Yoma.
Okay, so that's the second source,
Yeah, go ahead.
about the rabies.
Yeah. There is further on in the book, and we'll use the one that you have in front of you. This description of the spread of a disease, right? See, this is the description. You had meningitis,
Yeah.
and
Machalat HaShivta.
you had the machalat hashivta, and you had this one, which is no, not rabies yet.
Yeah.
This is the one,
Yeah, this is
the rabies one.
Yoma.
This is the
Yeah.
Gemara. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is the rabies one. This is the one with the okay. So the rabies one is extremely fascinating. I attended a lecture on Agnon, and the lecturer said that there is no way that the dog Balak, and Balak, you heard about him or it earlier today. Balak is a very controversial figure, is a very obviously essential figure. For some scholars and critics, he's perhaps more important or more significant than Yitzchak Kummer himself, the human protagonist and the dog and there are, well, we won't talk about the dog too much, but in rabies. So, but Agnon never, throughout this book, to the end, he never uses the word kalevet, which is the modern word for rabies. So the lecturer said, there's no way that anybody or any animal could be rabid since there is no kalevet in the book. So I didn't say anything during the lecture, but I went over to her afterwards and said, well, the problem is yours, not his. Kalevet, Agnon, who was also Agnon was a member of the Hebrew Academy, and he didn't like that because Kalevet in the sources means a pack of dogs. And Agnon's sources, as you've already most probably understood, start from the Bible and keep going. Through Hasidic and Misnagdic and Hungarian, whatever you want. And of course now with the computer you can get to most things. But at any rate, I said the problem, unfortunately, is the readers. I didn't want to say it's yours. But the problem, why? Because Agnon assumed that every Hebrew reader knows that a kelev shoter, Shin, Vav, Tet, Hey, that a kelev shoter is a rabid dog. Now he's going to play with that in other places, but first let's get finished with this one. So what he does is he quotes the Gemara, Masechet Yoma, and it gives you the description, well, you have a translation, in Hebrew of the results of what a rabid dog looks like. He doesn't have to tell you that the dog is affected by or has kalevet. You know it from the way that, and it says in the Gemara, it says, this is a braita in the Gemara, this is that, what are the simanim of a kelev shoter? A, B, C, D, and Agnon takes his...
Yeah, right.
Chamisha simanim ne'emru b'kelev shoter. So here, the text, the unmentioned text, or the text, the Talmudic text, gives you the key to understanding the description. But he assumed, Agnon assumed, that by this time you knew it. Because, and here I will expand on this a little bit, earlier in the book, the dog, who's a kind of is this fascinating figure, and I've read several books. There's a new book that just came out about smelling and the dog by Alexander Horowitz, a professor at Barnard College, who had written an earlier book about dogs. But now I'll have to mention this one because this dog goes around smelling all the time, as most dogs do. And she has, I only had the review in the Times, so that holds up the book too, see, because you never know who else is going to write about these things. So at any rate, that dogs primarily are smelling animals. They smell things, and their tail wiggles, flags, based on what they're smelling. I don't want to go through all the details. They're all in the New York Times a few days ago. Alexander Horowitz is the author. But anyway, back to this. When you see this dog walking, looking and acting this way, but earlier there's a very fascinating, extremely, what should I say, not easily understood section. Yitzchak Kummer becomes a painter. And he has this nudnik around, this dog keeps getting in his way. So he kind of chases the dog away, but the dog comes back again, and he chases the dog away, and the dog comes back again. And then he does something with the paint. It's not exactly clear what he does with the paint, but the paint on its own somehow drips and writes on the back of the dog, Kelev Shoteh. A Kelev Mishuga. Kelev Mishuga. Kelev Mishuga. That's not Hebrew. That's Yiddish. I'm a shigan in Hind. Kelev is Kelev in Yiddish too. So, this dog was supposed to wander around, or likes to wander around, where in Yerushalayim? Mea Shorim. So, Agnon is kind of making a comment about the Jews in Mea Shorim who are not Talmidei Chachomim, see? If he wrote Kelev Shoteh, what would they understand it to mean? No! No! A foolish dog! A shoite, a kelev shoite. So you don't want him to think that. You want him to think that he is rabid. So you write kelev mishuga. That's Yiddish. A mishigan a hint. That's the way you say a rabid dog in Yiddish. And that kelev.
Well, that's why they respond to him.
Right. Otherwise, they wouldn't understand what's the big deal. So he's a hint. Let him wander around. But once it painted itself, once the dog's back is painted with his kelev mishuga, you run away from him. Everybody runs away from him except Yitzchak Kummer. But okay, that's for another chapter. Yitzchak Kummer ultimately, and they didn't want him to take, ultimately he gets bitten by this dog. The dog takes it. And he gets rabies, and he dies. At the end of the book, he dies. We'll talk about the end in a few minutes. But at any rate,
we really have a few minutes.
The one of the editors at Shokin serves another purpose as the common reader. She reads to tell me what you can assume the average Hebrew or the regular. The common reader in Israel, what Hebrew that person knows already. So,
and it's often quite shocking.
It's often quite shocking what they do know or don't know.
Usually
so you don't have to explain. But what you have here is a description. However, he sneaks into this description something which is not in the Gemara. Einav shotetot dam. Right? What?
Tosasot.
Tosasot dam. His eyes, tosasot dam. They're bloody. That's not in the Gemara. That came from another book. I said, where did he get it from? It's not in the Gemara. It's not in any of the usual sources. It turns out, after much research, that in the book by Amuna Yaron, Agnon's daughter, she mentions a book about animals that he used to read to her and her brother, Chemdat. That's another story. His name was, actually his name is something else, but they called him Chemdat. Yeah, right. At any rate, so that comes from that book. In that book, it's clear that a rabid dog's eyes are bloodshot. So that's where that came from, but he kind of weaves it into the Gemara as if it's part of the Gemara. But if you checked it,
This is the Gemara.
pardon?
He doesn't claim that
He
it's
doesn't
the Gemara,
claim.
but
No,
he's-
he doesn't
he's
claim that it's in the
convoluting two
Gemara.
different sources.
No, he doesn't give you the source, but he weaves it into the description, which is based on the Gemara.
We have still in Beit Agnon, there's a section of books which seem to be the books on veterinary science and other
Correct.
things that he was drawing on for his knowledge of.
He was
this
all
and
over.
other
He was all over the place.
But we have to wrap up. But let me ask you just one last question. I'll
Yes.
ask you to respond briefly. Part of my encounter with Achnasat Kala was through using your work. On my maiden voyage through the novel as a novel, I relied on your book. I didn't read the book. I didn't read the novel with your book in hand. I used it as a reference on the side because you start going down the rabbit hole, and then it's hard to
Get back in place.
well, it's hard to enjoy the novel to let the words of the prose kind of enter you
Right.
without constantly stopping and starting. But the work on Tzmol Shel Shom. But part of what that encounter with Achnasat Kala through your work was, it's a time machine. It helps us bridge the chasm that really does exist between us and already between Agnon, and between Agnon and the world he was describing of 100 and 150 years earlier. And no matter how modern Agnon was, we are more modern than he, and we are at greater remove from the events described. And part of the achievement of your work and part of the benefit of encountering Agnon through the works of Avram Holtz is the wormhole that we're allowed to get back to that world. Now working on Tzmol Shel Shom, and since we're here talking today about Sipurei Eretz Yisrael, give us one insight, one small little nugget, briefly. Something that you have uncovered in the work on Tzmol Shel Shom that opened up a window to what it meant to be a young man coming on Aliyah, on the second Aliyah to Yafo or to Yerushalayim in 1908, 1909, 1910.
I'd have to answer that by saying, for example, let's follow him. Let's follow Yitzchak Humer. I don't assume that he is identical with Agnon, but let's assume that he arrived on Lag BaOmer 1908, and he comes to Yafo. He meets a person who fools him initially, the owner of some kind of an inn in Yafo. And there's an extremely significant book, which if I had held up Tzmol Shel Shom up until this point, and had missed this book, it's called Immigranti. Every chapter in that historical study of what it meant to be an immigrant to Eretz Yisrael, not necessarily a chalutz, but a person who arrived in Eretz Yisrael, what you actually encountered. You encountered these people who unfortunately were there to make money. And so they would do all kinds of things to make certain that they got your money. So they're not very pleasant people, and it's not a very pleasant time, and it's not a happy time, and you're full of problems. So what Yitzchak Kumar encounters is that world. First of all, the sense of being an immigrant, the sense of that place, it is Eretz Yisrael. Yitzchak Kumar has the chutzpah to say earlier on in the ship, I don't have to have family in Eretz Yisrael. Kol Yisrael chaverim. Well, you can read the response to that by an older person who said, yes, that's wonderful. But that you say only on Shabbos Mevorchim. On Shabbos Mevorchim, you say chaverim kol Yisrael. But not here. And he remembers that. And that re-echoes again later. And later, little did he know that was going to be his wife's grandfather. But at any rate, that's part of the beauty of the story. But you do encounter, and this person who wrote the book, Guy Alroy, every chapter in his historical study of immigrantim begins and ends with a quotation from Shmuel Shulchan.
Right.
It's called immigrantim. In Hebrew.
Translated into English.
We have to end. We could stay here talking all day, but that would prevent you from writing another 10 footnotes, and we can't afford that delay. So with our thanks to you for your work, we'll end here.